Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rada Madrigal. I'm one of the client trainers with the California ISO. I've been with the company for about 20 years now and looking forward to taking you through the day-ahead market content today. This morning, Heidi laid a foundation for you of the WEIM, some of the foundational concepts of how it works, and I'm going to build upon that by kind of explaining to you, like taking a step back in time, if you will, to talk about how we get ready for the market a day in advance. What are the things that we're doing in our BA in the day ahead market time frame to become prepared for real time? We're going to cover bidding and scheduling. We're going to talk about the day ahead market timeline and processes. And we're going to, I would say those are going to be high level concepts. If you imagine perhaps taking a helicopter ride with me and I'm your pilot. So we're going to, start off, maybe we're going to take off of a mountain and we're going to talk about bidding and self-scheduling. We're going to go over timelines and processes. Then we're going to dip down real close to the grass there for a moment and we're going to talk you through locational marginal pricing, how we actually set those prices, what the components are of each price, and then we're going to dive a little bit deeper into how we manage congestion rents in our BA. Some of these things are setting you up for discussion or giving you things to think about for this afternoon when Phil and Milos will talk to you about how we intend to extend the day ahead market and offer it to the larger Western area. So we'll touch on congestion revenue rights and we'll talk about how we manage those congestion rents in RBA. We'll touch a little bit on convergence bidding. We'll talk about market outputs. Heidi did have a brief section about settlements and how we handle that. I'll talk to you about how the day ahead market sets that up, and then we'll close for the day or for myself, and then we'll move over to the last topic of the day, which is the extended day ahead market. So that's kind of an overview to set the expectations with you about the path that we're going to go on together. This slide here just gives you a brief overview to explain that the ISO has a number of different roles. We are a grid operator, a market operator. We also have a reliability coordinator function. For our own BA, we're maintaining the reliability of the grid, managing the flow of energy. We are overseeing the transmission planning process. And today's focus during this session is going to be on this operating of the wholesale electric market. For much of the Western US, we also provide the Western EIM or the WEIM footprint and market operations of that in real time. Like I said, Heidi touched on that with you a little bit today. And we also serve as the reliability coordinator for much of the West. We're going to focus a little bit of fun animation here in reverse. The focus of today's concepts, when I am talking about who is going to be scheduling or bidding, those are going to be folks that fall into this category of scheduling coordinator. So in order to do business in the ISO market, you need to either be a scheduling coordinator or use the services of a scheduling coordinator. So today, all of the WEIM participants are at least one scheduling coordinator for the entity that's participating. And then there may be also additional scheduling coordinators that are participating in the market on behalf of those participating resources as well. So whichever side that you fall under, whether you're the scheduling coordinator for the larger entity, so the balancing area, or those individual participating resources, there is a process of certification, responsibilities and contracts that they need to fill out, and also financial settlements between the ISO in its role as market operator and then those scheduling coordinators who are participating today in the WEIM. So what does the day ahead market do? Essentially, a day in advance, we are making sure that we are prepared for the coming day. So each individual day that we talk about, we'll call it a trade date. So we have a day ahead market for tomorrow's trade date, if we think about tomorrow, June 2nd. So today, we will have run the day ahead market for the coming day. And then in real time, as that day actually progresses, we have the real time market activity. The reason why, essentially, we've got the day-ahead market. For our BA, we are procuring resources economically to meet the reliability needs of that balancing area. So making sure that we're ready a day in advance, and that's how we choose to line up all of the resources to meet that demand that's going to materialize in the following day. So our first section today, and I have about 45 slides, and we've got about an hour and a half or so for this section. We have extra time, so there's plenty of time for questions. So if we want to stop at each slide for questions, I'm happy to do that. I'm going to kind of glance out to the audience and see, if you're tracking with me, or if you'd like to ask a question, or kind of just feel free to raise your hand. We definitely have plenty of time to go through these concepts with you. And I think it would be best if we addressed them as they come up naturally, kind of more conversational, if you will. So please don't be shy about piping in with questions. We definitely have enough time to get to everything that you're curious about. So the first section here is economic bids and what we call self-schedules. Now here we're talking about bids for energy, and we're also going to talk about something that we call a bid curve. The slide that's building here under the supply column shows a supply curve. And that's demonstrated by, you can see that as the megawatts increase, or the quantity that I'm offering into the market increases, and those numbers are there along the bottom. On the left side, the price increases as I'm offering more to the market. So essentially, from a supply perspective, I'm either a generator, or I am outside of the ISO-BA importing my energy into the ISO-BA in this day-ahead time frame. Those are considered imports and still considered a supplier. Essentially, what they're saying is the higher the price, the more that I'm willing to supply to the market. So my supply curve is what we call monotonically increasing, or it goes up in dollars. And then on the demand side, if you think of it from a purchaser's perspective, their curve looks different. So the lower the price, the more they're willing to buy. Think of it like from the concept of a bulk discount. If I'm going to buy a lot from you, I would like to get a better, more cheaper price. So on the demand side, in the day-ahead time frame, load-serving entities who are bidding into the market on behalf of, or with the intention to meet that load for the coming day, they submit their demand curves. Now, the day-ahead market is unique in that this is the only opportunity for load-serving entities to submit a demand bid, meaning this is my one opportunity to give the market an economic signal to say, in the day-ahead time frame, I would like to procure X number of megawatts. If the price is such and such or less, I'm willing to lock in this many megawatts. In real time, there are no bids from the demand perspective. In real time, both for when you're thinking of from the WEIM perspective and just the greater real-time market in general, we're looking to clear the market against a forecast. So in day ahead, that's the only opportunity for load to provide an economic signal to the market. We also have something called self-schedules, and those are bids for megawatts without any prices. And my next slide goes a little bit more into self-schedules, but before we move there, I wanted to see if anybody had any questions about just the basic supply and demand bids and how that works from a day-ahead perspective.
Do generators have more than one opportunity to bid? You said that demand only has the one opportunity.
Yes, so generators have the ability to bid both into the day-ahead market and into the real-time market as well, yes. So they have two opportunities to bid their supply in, yeah. Other questions? Okay. So the self-schedules, we also refer to these as price takers. From a supply perspective, what that means is I'm informing the market, I'm going to be running my generator and I'm willing to accept whatever that market clearing price is. I may have a contract that I need to, outside of the market that I need to fulfill. I need to provide X number of megawatts to this load serving entity. I'm going to schedule my supply into the market. It needs to be delivered. I'm just going to put my megawatts in, and whatever the market clearing price is, I'm willing to accept that. On the demand side, it would be the same type of a thing. I need to procure, let's say, 1,000 megawatts in hour ending such and such of the coming day. I will pay whatever that market clearing price is. So both on the supply side and the demand side, you can be a self-schedule or essentially a price taker. I've got an example of how we then clear the market by lining up all of the supply bids on a supply curve. So that would be the green line on this chart that goes upward. And then all of the demand bids on this demand curve. And again, that would be the one that's in blue that goes downward. Where those two bid curves cross, that determines the total cleared demand for this particular hour. So when we're talking about the day ahead market, there's 24 hours. So there will be 24 different prices and 24 quantities of demand that clear for this particular hour. So that's total cleared demand for that particular hour. That sets the market clearing price for energy for that particular hour. And you can see over here on the left side of the chart, we have the demand and the supply self-schedules lined up at the beginning of both of those economic curves because their price is zero. And you'll see graphically a depiction of more demand self-schedules than there are supply self-schedules typically. So you're going to see more self-schedules from the demand side. They need to meet their load for the coming day. They're going to take whatever the market clearing price is, and that gets scheduled in. This little green square that we're popping up here is just a reminder or a refresher for you that in the day ahead market, in what we call the integrated forward market process, we clear bid in supply against bid in demand. And the nuance there is that, number one, there isn't a requirement for demand to have to bid all of their load forecast for the coming day. So they don't have to bid everything in the day ahead. And there's an economic signal coming from both the supply side and the demand side. So when we're clearing the market in this very first process, the integrated forward market process, there is a possibility that we will not have cleared supply for the full hour that's needed, which is why we have a process later called residual unit commitment. And I'll talk more about that when we get to that process. But think of this first piece as the financial part of the market. We're lining up the buyers and sellers. They each have economic signals. We're clearing as much through the market as possible based on the economic signal for each one of those hours. So the bids that come in, they'll have 24 different supply curves or demand curves for each of the 24 hours, and each hour will clear separately. The market does an optimization where it looks at the full 24 hours of that trade date and makes a determination of the best way to use those resources that have bid in across that full 24-hour time frame. So when you're thinking about from a day ahead perspective, the majority of our market transactions take place in the day ahead time frame. I would say about 90% of that market activity is being locked in the day ahead. And then we have residual activity that occurs in real time. Another point to make is that, again, and I had said that before, that real time we're clearing supply against the forecast. So in real time, whatever from a demand perspective that I was not able to procure in the day ahead, I end up paying in real time for at whatever that real time price is. So it's kind of a business decision from the load serving entity perspective, how much of their load forecast they want to bid in for in each one of those hours. And then there's also a determination of whether or not there's corresponding, economic signals from suppliers that are willing to supply at that price, if that makes sense. Any questions on this bid curve chart that we're looking at? All right, we'll move forward. So how does the market figure out which resources to commit. Now, I believe Heidi used this word commit or commitment before, and she's also used the word dispatch, and I'd like to just touch on it again. When you hear the word commitment from a market perspective, what we are saying is the market is selecting or choosing which resource to turn on and use, and then eventually also determining when to shut that resource down. So the market committing a resource is choosing essentially which resources we're going to turn on or off throughout that full 24-hour time period. And a distinction that I'd like to make or have you consider is that in the real-time market, and when I say real-time market, I mean both for the ISO footprint and WEIM as well, it's the exact same market that is running. There aren't two separate markets, an ISO market and a WEIM. It's the same exact market processes happening at the same time for the whole footprint. There are just a couple of nuances for what we do in our BA from an ancillary services or a reliability perspective that we are only doing for our BA and not for the WEIM folks. So when we're saying committing resources, the market is choosing both for the ISO BA and all WEIM participants, essentially, who they're committing or what resources we're turning on. So that word commitment applies in day ahead and it applies in real time as well. So how does the market figure out which resources to use? If I've got all of these supply curves from a fleet of varying resources, how does the market figure out which is the most economic resource to select? And also, what other factors come into play? So I've got a chart here that kind of shows you, let's say we have 5 different suppliers. They're bidding in supply curves for each one of these resources, and let's say that curve in about the $20 range. So if you were to look at this just visually, the top line, you would think, well, how do we figure out which resource to pick? Are we going to try to say, well, maybe we should go with renewables first, or should we go with, another resource, or figure out if the wind is blowing? How does the market figure out which one to select? And one of the things that I wanted to share with you is it's not just the bid price that is factored into the equation. When a participant submits a bid, we call that bid a 3-part bid. So it includes startup costs for the resource, which is essentially how much does it cost to fire up that resource? And where do we have this information? Heidi had touched on our master file database that keeps track of all of the individual characteristics for each of these resources. So based on that master file data, we know how much it costs to start up your individual resource. The next thing that we take a look at is the minimum load cost, which is an hourly cost. How much does it cost to have this resource on, running at their PMIN, that physical minimum, for that particular hour? And then their bid curve is essentially offering supply over and above that PMIN for certain economic prices based on the quantity of megawatts that this resource is able to provide. So there will be a 3-part bid that the market analyzes. So the key point or takeaway from this slide is just that the bid price itself is not the only factor considered, but there's more about that individual resource that's put into the equation when the market is doing this optimization. Any questions about how that works? All right. Other things, so it's not just the bid price or the characteristics of the resource or the costs associated with running that particular resource, but there are also other pieces to the puzzle, if you will, that we're going to kind of piece together here. So in the middle of this slide is the day-ahead market optimization. So that is the market software or the market engine, you might have heard it referred to as, or security constrained unit commitment, a bunch of different fancy words, but essentially what we're saying is the market engine has all of these inputs that it pulls in. One of them is bids. Another is the network model, which Heidi spoke to you a little bit about earlier. The network model is essentially a representation of the physical transmission system. So all of the lines, where they're located, their ratings, their capabilities, in addition to all of the generating resources. Where are they located in this model? So that we are able to map and determine how the energy would flow throughout the entire system. So we have a network model that includes all of the participants in the market. So the ISO-BA, all of the WEIM participants, as part of joining and participating in WEIM, we obtain information from them about all of their resources and add that to the network model. And then if you think about it from a larger reliability perspective, we also have, because we are the reliability coordinator for majority of the West, we also have that network model kind of already built out because we have that RC, or that reliability coordinator data, in the model as well. So again, it's designed to give the ability so that we can do these power flow studies and determine how the energy is actually going to flow throughout the system. Transmission limits, so limits on each one of the different transmission lines, making sure that they're operating within their capabilities. This last box here at the bottom is resource parameters. That is a callback to the master file data. All of that individual information about your resource. How long does it take you to start up? Once I have started up this resource, is there a minimum on time before I can turn that resource back off? All of those things are factored into the market optimization. Another thing that we look at is forecasts, not just forecast for your load in your particular area, but also forecasts of variable energy resource output. So a solar resource, a wind resource, we have their forecast data, and we will use that forecast data to either cap or extend the market award for that particular resource to kind of be able to get that full capability or potential from that resource by comparing what its forecast is to what that resource had bid in. And then finally, we also have information about outages on the system. And that could be either on the transmission side or the generation side as well. Essentially, the market consumes that information so that we know what lines are in or out of service, what resources may be on, but running at a lower capability. That term is called a D-rate, when you've got, let's say, a P max of 500 megawatts, but for whatever reason, we're taking it down, and today they can only run at 300. They would have an outage for that D-rate, is that terminology. So we know exactly what the fleet is able to do so that the market can get the full output from that resource, but also not award it at a level that it is not able to provide, if that makes sense. Any questions on kind of this big picture and how all of the pieces fit together? Yes.
Are the inputs different for the real-time market?
The real-time market inputs are a little bit different. So some of this data and the results that come out of day ahead are fed into the real-time market from a scheduling perspective. If you think about this from the perspective of WEIM, because they are not participating in the day ahead market, they have this concept, which you're familiar with, the base schedule concept. So they have a base schedule for each of their resources coming into each of the trade hours in real time. For the ISO participants who have participated in day ahead, think of that base scheduling activity is already taking place, and those market awards could essentially be that base schedule. And then in real time, what is also new are bids from the WEIM participants as well. So more bids coming in real time from a larger pool of participants. And then also in real time, we have a couple other things, such as something called the state estimator, which essentially gives us real time telemetry and topology information. So exactly what the flow of energy is on the lines, and we get that updated every 4 seconds. So we kind of know exactly what's happening from a physics perspective. If you think about the market, when we are making awards, really it's a financial scheduling of electricity But then also from a physics perspective, there, you know that electricity will flow along the path of least resistance. So we're also kind of tracking exactly how that's flowing as well.
I had a question.
Yes.
How often are you dealing with like errors submitted on behalf of maybe scheduling coordinators? I mean, is a lot of it already automated now? So there's not, you know, like I'm thinking human input into an Excel spreadsheet versus, yeah, some machine doing it. I guess I'm trying to understand and then how that impacts the master file. Just curious.
Sure. So if you think about master file data, that is relatively static in that when you submit it, update, it takes about 5 business days to get that changed. So your resource parameters are not changing in master file on a day by day, hour by hour basis. That is much more a, you know, official nameplate capabilities of this resource is in master file. But from an outage perspective, I could submit that data in real time. If I have a unit that goes out of service unexpectedly, I can let the market know by submitting an outage on that. It is possible to have human error, you know, when you're saying, oh, I'm going to be, you know, taking this resource from 500 megawatts to 200 and maybe they only put 20. So things like that I'm sure do occur, but there's, you know, there's some checking on both sides, I would say, that exist. But there have been things that have happened because of human error. And it's usually, you know, when a participant will say, how come I didn't get awarded for such and such in this particular hour, you know, after the fact? And they do a little bit of research and we're like, well, the outage said that you were fully, you know, that you weren't available in this particular time period. So there could be human error in that perspective, but I would say that it's not something that we come across on a in great quantity or on a regular basis. A lot of data that gets fed to us is through an automated system. So we have like forecast information that's coming in, or like I said, the telemetry from that resource to know exactly how they're operating and at what level. But you know, we are humans using technology, so there's a chance for things like that to happen. But I would say that it's not pervasive. Yeah. All right. So that was a little discussion about bidding and scheduling. So from a participant perspective, their inputs into the market are going to be those economic bids or those self-schedules. Again, this is from the day ahead perspective. So the day ahead market closes 10 a.m. the day before, and prior to that, the day ahead market had opened 7 days before that. So some folks, you can, if you want to, put bids in a number of days in advance. Maybe that happens a little bit more over like weekends or long holidays. But generally, there's someone checking closer to that real-time market close at 10 a.m. to make sure everything's good and set so that the market will run for the coming day. 10 a.m. the market closes, and then we have a couple of hours for these market processes to run. And at about 1300 is when the market results are published, and then that triggers the opening of the real-time market. So all of our discussion today is going to kind of be in the what is happening between 10 a.m. and 1300. And then we're going to do a little bit of after the fact at the end of the day to talk about settlement for that activity. But it's a couple of hours of time frame that we're going to walk through with you today. Now there's a question.
During those 7 days where you have the ability to submit bids, are there schedules being run for the week ahead?
Do you mean from the market perspective? Are we running
Yeah.
schedules for the week ahead? Not necessarily. We do about 2 to 3 days in advance. In one of our processes, the residual unit commitment will actually look out a couple of days, but we're not we don't have any binding schedules that are occurring a week in advance, but maybe 2 or 3 days in advance, we have some what we call extremely long start commitment resources that might take a couple of days to get a heads up. And so there is a bit of that occurs.
Okay, and that's published out to the market to inform everybody?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, to inform everybody, let me be clear on that. The market, if you are the one that has that schedule, you receive that information. But for everybody else, those market awards are actually confidential data. So you don't really know the plan for the entire broad market. You only get data about if you're a scheduling coordinator, your own resource fleet. So you kind of have a picture of your own world. And then there are reports at an aggregate level that will explain maybe how many megawatts were obtained. But if you're not one of those participants, you don't quite know who exactly got that award, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is the longer term schedule informed by the bids that have been submitted by so far or by standing bids? Or,
Informed by what? I'm sorry?
say a participant had submitted bids 6 days beforehand, would that inform that long term schedule, or would it be a standing bid that was existing already that would inform it?
To be truthful, I don't know how many folks are putting in bids 6 days in
Yeah.
advance. That there's the capability to do that, but the likelihood that they're planning that far in advance is probably it's probably not happening. But it could be based on, I'm trying to kind of hypothetically imagine if that's what they were doing. They would probably be doing it based on pre-existing contracts that they have already, perhaps.
Because there's no benefit to them in doing it too early. They're not going to see
Right,
any
right. It's kind of a
schedule
little
result from
early,
it.
6 days in advance. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Rada, this is Phil. I know of some instances where some of the market participants will have, what I'll use the term placeholder bids. So they want to make sure that they don't miss something, so they may be putting in a set of bids that is like, if for whatever reason they forgot or something happened, they know they have bids in the market. So that's one strategy they would use. But then like Rada's saying, those are only placeholders. They will still come back prior to 10 a.m. and put in a more accurate structure that they want to, right? But they may still have standing bids that they want to put in all the time so they know there's something.
Okay. I'm just comparing it to other markets where you would, 7 days out, submit your bids, then see how it pans out for the week, and then revise it the next day and see how it pans out. So I was sort of wondering, was that a thing that you guys
Got
did
it.
as
It's a
well?
little different than
Yeah.
that. Yeah. Yeah. There's not a lot of forward scheduling happening that many days in advance. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So this next graphic, the goal of this is to make sure we're all on the same page with regard to energy and capacity, because I'm going to be talking about those two different products. And so I want to make sure that we can kind of paint a picture for you. So here we have, when we talk about energy versus capacity, a concept of, I've got this water faucet, and behind this water faucet in the reservoir that I'm attached to is all of the water that I can tap into, no pun intended. And so that technically would be my capacity of this resource, if we want to say that this is a resource. If I actually turn that handle and the water starts to flow, that is what we would call energy. So from a market perspective, your capacity is your potential to provide me everything that you have in your resource, but it's not actually energy until you are generating it. And so capacity is essentially a reservation for energy, and energy is actually the energy that's going to be flowing. So if we put this together in the concept of the market products that we're talking about, we determine in day ahead how much energy is going to be purchased for each hour. And we do that based on this one process, the integrated forward market, that lines up all of the supply bids, all of the demand bids. We kind of drew this picture out for you before. The total cleared demand sets that market clearing price for energy for this particular hour. When you talk about the market, you'll hear this word called interval. So in the day ahead time frame, every interval is 1 hour. So there will be 24 hours in the day ahead market. So each hour will have its own market clearing price for energy for that particular hour. In real time, we've got 4 15-minute intervals in each one of those hours. And then that breaks down also into 12 5-minute intervals. So it gets very granular in real time. But in the day ahead perspective, we're just talking about hourly. So every hour there will be a market clearing price for energy, and that is the same across the entire system. So every pricing node will have the exact same price of energy for each one of these hours. There are other factors, and a little bit later I'll go into our pricing model with you where I will explain each one of the other elements. But for now, just remember that in the day ahead market, we're setting the market clearing price for energy, and it'll be an hourly price. This same activity occurs in real time, but there will be 15-minute or 5-minute prices. And in real time, the only difference between how we are clearing is that in day ahead, we're clearing bid in supply against bid in demand. And in real time, we're clearing bid in supply against the forecast for whichever interval that we're clearing for. So it could be a 15-minute forecast or a 5-minute forecast based on the time of day and what's happening in real time. So think of it as, in day ahead, it's 24 hours, and in real time, it's kind of sped up so that each hour we're doing a bunch of different smaller mini clearings, if you will. In real time, just as an anecdote, the bids are still on an hourly basis. So in real time, the WEIM participants, when they're submitting bids, they're submitting hourly bids. And those same bids for that hour are going to be used during the 15-minute and those 5-minute optimization runs. The same set of bids for that 1 hour that they submitted gets used multiple times in real time. So that was the energy piece. In day ahead, we determine how much energy is going to clear for each hour. And then the next category, which is capacity, or essentially a reservation for energy or the potential to provide energy. We purchase capacity just for the ISO BA to meet a number of different reliability requirements. So regulating reserves are met by two different products, regulation up and regulation down, essentially moving these resources to either increase or decrease their output. We use these regulating reserves to manage the frequency of the grid. So we plan a day in advance to lock those in for the following day. We also have something called contingency reserves. And the word contingency, if you're not familiar with it, it's essentially how we use this term to essentially say, something bad or unusual that might happen that we need to plan for. So a contingency officially is something like an outage that is possible or eventually probable that would do such and such. So essentially it's kind of trying to plan for the unknown. If we lose a resource here, what are we going to do to compensate for that? If we lose a transmission line over here, how are we going to reroute that power so that it doesn't overload the rest of the system? All of that activity and those individual, bad things that could occur, those are contingencies. And the market has at its disposal, I want to say like 5,000 different contingencies that it could possibly be running, but we kind of narrow that down to a little bit under 200 based on probability. And that's why we have a whole slew of operating engineers to kind of help us narrow in or zero in on which contingencies are we going to have in place given system conditions and what we know about outages occurring all throughout the system. Also, new contingencies could pop up that we need to plan for, but essentially, we like to run the electric system. You may have heard this terminology before, N-1, so normal -1, meaning any one thing could go wrong and we could still kind of plan around it. And that's essentially how we're operating the entire system. So these reserves allow us to have that excess capacity to tap into should we need to use it. And then finally, this third process here, which is called residual unit commitment, is essentially, so residual is extra or additional, and unit speaks to the generating unit or resource, right? And then the commitment term, which we discussed earlier, is selecting which resources to turn off or on. So residual unit commitment is figuring out what extra resources we need to plan to turn on tomorrow based on the forecast that we need to meet. So all the way up until this point, we've been going against the demand bids that were submitted and comparing those against the supply bids. But like I said before, there isn't a requirement for everyone to bid in their full forecast in the day ahead. Essentially, their goal is to send an economic signal. So this residual unit commitment process allows us to make sure from a reliability perspective that we're going to be ready. And how we determine we're going to be ready is by looking at the forecast for the coming day and making sure in each one of those hours that we've procured enough supply to meet that forecast. So that's the goal of the residual unit commitment process. Any questions about how we manage capacity here? Yes.
At what point in the day ahead versus real-time market do you do residual unit commitment?
Residual unit commitment is only a day ahead process. So residual unit commitment is the third process. There's market power mitigation, which I'll talk to you about later. There's the integrated forward market that clears bid in supply against bid in demand. And then the final process in day ahead is residual unit commitment. That's the last thing we do. After we are finished with that, then we publish the market results at about 1300. In real time, we don't have a residual unit commitment process. In real time, we have other things, and also we're clearing against the forecast in real time. Residual unit commitment is the first time that we actually bring in the forecast to the market optimization to look at what that might mean for the coming day. I've got a chart here to kind of we've painted this picture for you a couple of times. We're going to add in this concept of residual unit commitment. The reason why we have it is to make sure that we can meet our forecast based on where it's needed, based on price and location. So in the ISO BA, there are some resources that have to offer their supply into the residual unit commitment product. Those resources that have to, that we call it must offer, fall under the category of resource adequacy. So how we handle resource adequacy in California is different than how it's handled across the greater West. But in California, our resource adequacy resources have to offer their supply into energy, into any of the ancillary services products that they qualify for, and into this residual unit commitment process. And kind of the reasoning behind that is if you have a resource adequacy contract, that means you're getting paid for this capacity. And part of that payment is an agreement that you're going to offer it to the market in all of the different ways it could be used. So some resources need to bid into this residual unit commitment process, and others have the option to bid or not to bid based on the type of contracts that they have. So when we draw a line here to say, for this one trade hour, we have cleared this amount of demand for that particular hour. With the residual unit commitment process, what we do is we take the ISO's load forecast for the coming day for each of those hours, and we kind of spread it across that full network model so that we know where we need to procure additional capacity for and how much. And then we use this RUC process to do exactly that. So folks bid into RUC, and those bids, if they clear, they get a requirement to bid that energy into real time for the amount of megawatts that they were awarded for whatever hours that they were awarded. So this is the market, our way of ensuring that even if we may not have met the entire demand forecast for that hour just with the supply bids, when you compare them to the economic signal from demand, we may or may not have covered that full hour. This RUC process goes in there, and the goal of that is to bridge that gap. So however many additional megawatts we need to procure for this particular hour, we do that through the RUC process. And the end result of that is, from a reliability perspective, we are now ready to meet that full forecast for the coming day in each of those 24 hours. Any questions about how that works?
So under the RUC process, do they clear at another market price compared to the day ahead folks?
Good question. So the question was about market pricing for RUC. So there's For energy, you have that supply curve, and it has varying price points along with increased quantity. For this RUC product, it's actually one price and a certain number of megawatts. And that price can be anywhere from $0 to $250. That's the parameters for RUC. And the energy, we haven't mentioned this, but I'll take a step back and say when you're offering energy, the bid floor is negative 150, and the bid ceiling is a soft cap of 1,000 or a hard cap of 2,000 if you can financially justify going above that $1,000 soft cap. So an energy bid could be anywhere from negative 150 to 2,000. For RUC, it's between 0 and 250. And the catch there, and not to belabor the point, but in the ISO BA with our resource adequacy contracts, if you already have a resource adequacy contract, when you're bidding into RUC, whatever you bid, the market considers your RA portion to be bid in at $0. So if you think about it from a capacity perspective, the market, the load serving entities have already contracted with these suppliers and are paying them for that capacity. So that obligation means that they have to offer into all of these products. Sometimes, specifically with RUC, they're offering in at $0. So there's some nuances there. And this, one of the goals in this presentation where I'm kind of laying the foundation for how the day ahead market works is my hope is to kind of give you little points to think about or talk about when Phil and Milos come up. And I'll try to kind of highlight throughout the presentation, this is how we do it in our BA. But for example, resource adequacy obviously is something that's a much larger topic and a much broader conversation, and probably not one that's going to become, one thing, because each state is going to handle that differently. So our goal with the market is to kind of make it so that the market can manage your own RA, however kind of you intend to do it, without trying to make it one big conglomerate, if that makes sense. So there's, the goal is to not take away each state's autonomy from their own programs. But so specifically with RA, I'll explain to you how we do it, but that's not to infer that that's how you would have to do it or the expectations for anybody outside of California would have to do. But that's how that works. Yes.
If a resource is not required, coming out of the RUC to provide that capacity, can then it bid into the real-time market?
Yes. So if you don't have to bid into RUC, you could be bidding into the day ahead, and then whether or not you're awarded, you could also then be bidding any additional capacity into real time as well. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Right. So coming out of day ahead, you will either have various market awards or not. And then in real time, your real-time awards may layer on top of what you received in day ahead. And if for some reason you didn't get picked up in day ahead, you have another opportunity to offer your resource into real time into each of the 24 hours of real time as well. I wanted to take a sidestep here for a moment to talk about market power. And this is something that I believe Milos is going to touch on a little bit later as well. The first thing that we do when we run the day ahead market is this process called market power mitigation. So first I'll kind of explain competitive bidding, and then we'll illustrate uncompetitive bidding and describe why market power is needed and kind of what we're doing. So in this first visual, we've got a number of different suppliers bidding into the market at various price points, indicating that there is some level of competition amongst suppliers to serve this load. Now, the concept of market power comes into play if I may be the only resource in a particular area. I could essentially charge whatever I wanted, and that area would have to buy power, or the market, as we clear for that area, would have to buy my energy because I'm the only game in town to supply this area. So if I have this kind of market power, I have the potential to drive prices up for my own benefit. And the goal of this market power mitigation process, which is the first process actually that runs in the day ahead market, we also anecdotally have market power mitigation in real time as well. So every time we're running the market for all of the intervals, whether it's hourly and day ahead, or whether it's 15 minutes and 5 minutes in real time, we're always doing this concept of market power mitigation. And it could get rather complex, so I'm going to try to keep it at a relatively high level. But essentially what we're doing is we're taking a look at, we call them constraints, so particular areas or location of the system, making sure that there are essentially enough bids that indicate that this area is competitive. And we do a series of tests where we essentially pull out what we call pivotal suppliers. So if I take a look at a constraint and I do an analysis that essentially says, if I remove the 3 largest players, is there enough supply left to meet that demand? And if not, then those pivotal suppliers kind of have the ability to control pricing, if you will. And so if that occurs, we do these tests, and if you have the potential for market power, it doesn't mean you're actually exercising it. But if you have the potential for market power, then we take a look at the bids that you have submitted. And if they are above, we do a pricing run, and if they are above that competitive price that we've determined, then we mitigate or we lower those bids to this predetermined number or predetermined calculation. And it's called, the terminology is called a default energy bid. It's something that each supplier sets up in advance. They choose, there's, I believe, 5 or 6 different methodologies for calculating your specific default energy bid. So you'll choose your method of calculation. Some of that might be involved with working with the ISO to negotiate a specific terms. Your master file data will also keep track of your default energy bid methodology. So if you have the potential for market power, it is possible that the bids that you were submitted, if they're higher than this competitive LMP that we've determined as part of this run, those bids get lowered or mitigated to this default energy bid. And then the market uses those numbers in its optimization or calculation. And that is like a 2-3 minute explanation of how market power mitigation works, just to kind of give you a flavor of that. But that is the very first thing that we're doing in the day ahead market before we do all of the clearing in the integrated forward market or the RUC process. Does anybody have any questions on that? Or maybe anything from my team, anybody wanted to add? Like I said, I think Milos might talk about it later.
So when you talk about mitigating the bid, you're doing this in your capacity as ISO and not as the imbalance market?
We're doing it in the capacity of the real-time market. So it occurs in WEIM as well as the ISO BAA. But there is different methodology that is used. And I think I have one more little bullet that I was going to pop up here. In the context of today's conversation, where I'm kind of laying the foundation for Milos and Phil to talk later, I did want to point out that when we're talking about the concept of EDAM and extending the day-ahead market, the current thinking is to extend the WEIM methodology of market power mitigation, but I know that that's something that's still kind of being discussed among the broader stakeholder and policy groups and discussions. So that's still kind of a discussion or a work in progress, but that's the thinking at the time. So there's a little bit of difference between how we do market power mitigation for the ISOBA and the greater WEIM, but it is something that is occurring today now.
Yeah, and if I can just, if you were getting at, who's doing the market power mitigation, it is the ISO in our role as market operator.
The default bid, could you just explain some of the factors that go into it? Like, does it ensure that the generator still gets a fair return based on that number?
Absolutely. And I know I have the privilege of having Amelia here, and maybe she could take a stab at this. She's from our DMM group, and maybe she can help give some context to that.
Yeah, for for context, the way that default energy bids are calculated is by adding up all of the costs. Sorry, I will speak into the microphone. The way that default energy bids are calculated is that all of the costs, incremental marginal costs, are added up. So think about fuel, maintenance, greenhouse gas compliance, whatever else you can think of. Those are all added up, and then to that is added a 10% buffer to account for. Exactly. There are a few different additional flavors so that you can ensure that any costs are captured.
Yeah, thank you, Amelia, for that brief description. There's pages and pages that kind of go into exactly the calculations for each one of those methodologies. That does exist in the business practice manuals if you were curious to dive into that, but that's kind of like essentially at a high level how it works. Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, I was wondering, are suppliers required to update their sort of their calculation at regular intervals? You know, perhaps if over time their costs went down and they had maybe an added benefit, is there a regular occurrence in which suppliers are required to update that calculation?
Yeah, I believe that I don't think that there's a set schedule. I believe that it occurs, but the level of frequency, to be honest, I'm not sure exactly how often those numbers get updated, but there isn't an official every year you have to double check and make sure it's right kind of a thing. But. Other questions about market power mitigation? I think we exhausted that topic. So I wanted to give you somewhat of an example to kind of pull this together. The day-ahead market, we've got suppliers that are bidding their supply into the market. We've got load-serving entities, again, exercising that one opportunity to provide an economic signal to lock in a certain amount of megawatts at a desired price. Again, anything from a demand perspective over and above whatever cleared in the day ahead, you're still going to be consuming, but you're going to be paying for that overage, if you will, at whatever the real-time prices are. So day ahead gives demand an opportunity to lock in or secure pricing at a price point that is agreeable to them for a certain percentage of their megawatts for each one of these hours. This example that I'm going to build for you is from the supplier's perspective. So I've got a resource here. I have a Pmin of 50 megawatts, so that's the lowest that I'm able to operate at reliably, and I have a Pmax of 140. And I'm going to submit bids into the market into a variety of products. Now, this specifically is how it works in the ISO BA in the day-ahead market. It would be a little bit different for the EDAM, and I'll explain to you what I mean by that. So first is a self-schedule. 70 megawatts of energy. So I'm a supplier. I've got a contract with a load serving entity. I need to be providing them 70 megawatts of my supply in this particular, let's say hour ending 11, just for discussion purposes. So I put in a self schedule of 70 megawatts that essentially says I'm going to be running 70 megawatts in this particular hour. Whatever the market clearing price is, that's great with me. Also, over and above that, I'm going to layer an additional 70 megawatts of economic bids that essentially says, if you want to move from my 70 megawatt self-schedule up into the full Pmax of my resource, the price needs to at least be such and such. And I could have a series of steps in my curve if I wanted to, from 70 to 80 to 90 and so forth. But essentially, I'm offering additional supply to the market with an economic signal or a price associated with that. I also, from a capacity perspective, this resource, it's certified to provide ancillary services. So I'm going to also submit a bid for 40 megawatts of ancillary services. So spinning reserves, I'll just say for discussion purposes. If you take a look and you add up all of the megawatts, you can see obviously I couldn't do all of these things, because 70 plus 70 plus 40 is more than the full Pmax of my resource. But what we have in the ISO BA is what we call co-optimization, meaning that the supplier will offer its resource into a variety of products. And then the market will co-optimize, meaning it will analyze this bid or this resource based on its energy bids and its ancillary services bids and figure out the best way to use this resource across this time period. And it will only award you as appropriate. And if I have a 70 megawatt self-schedule, and then let's say I get picked up for an additional 30 megawatts of energy, that puts me at, I'm using 100 megawatts from this resources. I could technically tap into the remaining 40 megawatts for ancillary services. But if I went any higher, let's say I took 50 additional megawatts for energy. So I've got 70 megawatts of a self-schedule plus an additional 50 for energy. Well, that only leaves 20 megawatts left over that I could award this resource for ancillary services. So the market will figure out, and that process of figuring that out is called co-optimization. Now, I wanted to point out, and I stressed the ISO BA because the way we are going to handle ancillary services in EDAM is slightly different. My understanding is that in EDAM, the ancillary services or these capacity products are going to be self-provided. So the BA will identify how many megawatts of ancillary services are going to be provided or used, but they're not going to be like this in the form of bids into both energy or ancillary services from all of the participants. Did I characterize that accurately?
Yeah.
Okay, wanted to make sure. So I kind of wanted to point out a little bit of a difference for how we clear energy and capacity in the day ahead perspective from the ISO BA. It's like this picture here. If you put on your EDAM hat, then there isn't going to be this series of ancillary services bids. Ancillary services is going to be self-provided, so it'll be handled a little bit differently. And we can wait for Milos to tell us a little bit more about how that works, or Milos and Phil, the dynamic duo later. So that was a little bit of an example from a supply perspective. Actually, before we go on to the next slide, I wanted to check and see, did that make sense? Did anybody have any additional follow-up questions on how this example worked? Okay. So when we're talking about day ahead and reliability, in our role as grid operator, we need to make sure that we have a plan for the coming day. And the way we do that is through the ISO day ahead market. So resources are committed, again, selected. We figure out which resources we're going to be using. We are clearing supply to meet that demand based on those demand bids that have been submitted. And then after we clear bid and supply against bid and demand, we take a look at the forecast for the coming day. And we use the residual unit commitment process to make sure that according to the forecast, we've got all of that demand covered for each one of those hours. And then again, those ancillary services that we are procuring, those 6% of load or 6%, which consists of 3% of load and 3% of generation, those same targets that everybody needs to meet, we're using ancillary services to meet those reliability targets as well. All right, let's do a time check. We started at 1, it's a little bit after 2. Maybe let's take a quick break before we get into locational marginal pricing. It is like 7 minutes after. How about we reconvene at 2:15, just to give you a little bit of stretch before we're about to go deep into pricing. So maybe get some coffee or a cookie or something. Okay, so we're back. Thank you for coming back so quickly. We're going to, like I told you earlier, we're taking this helicopter ride and we've kind of been at this high level. This piece right here, we're going to dive deeper and kind of get closer to the grass, if you will. And the purpose of this and the reason why we're going to take a deep dive here is for 2 reasons. We're going to deconstruct the locational marginal pricing components. And the goal of that is to give you a foundation for you to understand how our pricing model works because a little bit later, when we have the EDAM discussion later this afternoon, they're going to be talking to you about the greenhouse gas component. And that is something that gets added to this locational marginal price. So the LMP portion that we're talking about is kind of a buffer or a foundation for you to plug that GHG information into later. And then we also, when we talk about the 3 different components of the locational marginal price, we're going to take a moment to share with you how we manage the congestion component in the ISO BA. Now, it is still for you all to determine how you're going to manage the congestion component from an EDAM perspective and how that's going to work. But I wanted to explain to you how we do it in our BAA and what congestion revenue rights are and how we manage that. So we're going deep here for those 2 reasons. You're going to get a foundation for your GHG knowledge for later and an understanding of how we manage congestion so that you can kind of take that information and use it going forward when we're talking about congestion management in the EDAM perspective. So that's the goal for this little piece right here. So diving right into it, I've got this lovely map over here, which is essentially a visual for you that I will help kind of describe as we paint this picture here. Locational marginal pricing, the definition of what that is the marginal cost, and that term marginal is where we're serving the next increment of demand at a pricing location while respecting both the transmission constraints of the system and also performance characteristics of generating resources. So transmission constraints we have from the full network model and real-time information, and performance characteristics of resources, again, is that master file data. We know exactly how these resources can perform. So locational marginal pricing is figuring out a price at each one of these pricing nodes that respects the characteristics of essentially the transmission system and the generating fleet. And so that little visual there is to kind of help you tie that together, if you will. So there are 3 different components, base components, I should say, in the LMP. The first component is energy. And in the day ahead market, we talked about how we arrive at that energy component, right? We have bid in supply against bid in demand on 2 different curves. Where those 2 intersect, that determines the market clearing price for energy for that particular hour in day ahead. In real time, that same type of clearing is occurring, except we're clearing supply against a forecast instead of demand bids. But there's still this clearing activity that takes place where an energy price is set. In day ahead, that price is hourly. There will be 24 different prices in day ahead for energy for each hour. In real time, that pricing is at the 15 and the 5-minute level granularity. And again, it will always be one same energy price across the entire footprint, ISO and all WEIM participants combined, that one price of energy. But what changes the price at each individual nodes are the additional components that are factored into that pricing model. So I explained to you how we arrived at energy. So if we deconstruct the locational marginal price, I know it's hard to see visually on the slide here, maybe on your handouts in front of you, you can see that the energy price at all 3 of these nodes that I'm showing you is about $6.15, and there's some extra decimals there as well. So the energy price is always going to be exactly the same. Then there are other components. One is congestion, the other is losses. I'll start with losses first because congestion is going to kind of lead us into a path to also talk about congestion revenue rights. But energy is the first component. From the losses perspective, we're talking about transmission losses. So we've drawn a picture for you of the transmission system depicted very simply we've got 2 towers and a line in between those towers. And what we're saying is if you inject power into the system at a location, there is some energy that gets lost in the physical transmission from one place to another. And we use the network model to calculate how the electricity will flow throughout the system. And then we also have these loss factors that figure out the marginal losses based on the actual physical makeup of that line. So how long is this transmission line? What is it made out of? What is the surrounding weather and how it has an effect on how much energy is lost? All of that is physics and part of an equation that gets calculated and captured in this loss component. And when you look at the loss component of an LMP, the number is not usually a large number, not usually significant, but we are accounting for how much energy will be lost in the transmission that occurs in this particular situation. So each individual node across the system is going to have its own calculation based on how far away it is from substations and wholesale transmission lines, and all of that gets very granular and mathematic, but that's accounted for in the loss component. And then we have the congestion component. And this one I'm going to take a deeper dive into. And then once I kind of paint that picture for you, we'll take a step back and ask if you have any questions, kind of about this pricing model in general. So the concept of congestion is when we have, let's say, cheap electricity in generators that we can't necessarily get to the load because the transmission system is congested. Think of it as a freeway during rush hour, and we're trying to get everyone where they need to be, and we only have so many lanes. What if some of those lanes are closed? There will be detours and off ramps and all kind of planning that's involved with the flow of traffic. So you can kind of take that analogy and apply that to the flow of electricity throughout the transmission system. We only have, each transmission line has a certain rated capacity. We have to make sure that it's being managed within those limits from a reliability perspective. So therefore, sometimes we need to feed load from maybe higher priced resources in one location because there just isn't enough transmission capacity to get it from the cheaper resources that may be, say, further out. Congestion essentially prevents those low-cost resources from being able to meet all of that load. So we have to clear or procure energy from higher cost resources. Some reasons why congestion may occur is lack of transmission capacity, either because it's already been scheduled and already used up, or perhaps there are some lines out of service, either planned or not planned, that have to be, factored into the equation. So that is what congestion is. And then that is also captured in a cost component that's added to the LMP. And I've got, in addition to just explaining what congestion is, I actually have a little bit more of a detailed example that we're going to walk through to both explain congestion and then kind of lead into congestion revenue rights. So if you will indulge me for a moment and let's get through the example, then we'll stop for questions to kind of, I feel like this one isn't one where we want to dissect each component, but kind of understand how we fit it all together and then see what kind of questions come out of the discussion. So we've got energy congestion and losses. We're going to walk through an example that kind of explains how pricing is determined, first in a very simple example where there is no congestion, so you can kind of get a base concept, and then we'll layer in some complexity to build on your understanding. So this first example, there's no congestion, there's no losses. We've got load represented by this house picture here, 300 megawatts of load that needs to be served. There's a very simple transmission line diagram that's drawn up there for you. And there's two generators that are offering their supply to the market in order to serve that 300 megawatts of load. So there's no congestion on these particular lines. And given that there's no congestion, if you're the market whose goal is to find the most economic way to serve this load, the market sees bids from generator one, and they're bidding in 500 megawatts at $40. And then generator 2 is also bidding in 500 megawatts at $60. So this is the class participation section of today's session, kind of like a surprise pop quiz. If you were the market clearing this, trying to supply this load, then what would you do? Which generator would you select in order to meet this load? You could just shout it out if you would like. Generator 1. And why generator 1? Because it's cheaper. It's not a trick question. Absolutely. We're going to get 300 megawatts from the cheapest, most economic resource, not from the more expensive resource, and we're going to serve that load. So in this model, that generator that cleared sets the price for energy. In this simple example, the market clearing price for energy gets set at $40. That's what load ends up paying. That's what generator 1 ends up receiving. Again, at the title here, we say no congestion or losses, so all of the other components are at 0. This is just a very simple, this is how the price would be set if there was this scenario. Obviously, it's more complex with more load pockets and more generators, but you get the concept. Yes.
So just so I'm clear, so this is for a particular hour in the real-time market.
Yes, or day, we're doing a day ahead example here for, in this case, but yes, we do calculated congestion in the day ahead as well. So.
But would you also have locational marginal pricing in the real-time market?
Absolutely, yes. So day ahead or real time, but this example that I'm walking through is a day ahead example, but yes, this is how we would do it in real time as well. So yes, there's locational marginal pricing in real time. In day ahead, it's calculated congestion based on the power flow solution. We calculate how many congestion dollars will be accumulated. In real time, it's going to be actual congestion. So that's the only difference. So our second example, we're going to introduce congestion and see how that may affect pricing here. So we have the same scenario that we had before. The only thing that we've done is we've introduced some congestion. So that transmission line that used to have a 1,000 megawatt limit now can only flow 150 megawatts. So if I'm the market that needs to serve 300 megawatts of load and I have to do it in the most economic way, how do you think the market is going to make this decision? What would the market do? Anybody want to throw out some thoughts here? Okay, so one choice was serve the load from generator 2. Does anybody have any other thoughts about what the market might do? I hear a split, so we'll walk down that split concept, right? If you want to get 150 megawatts, as much as you can from the cheapest resource, you still have to get the remainder from the more expensive because you have to serve that load. Here, the concept of locational marginal pricing exists. So generator 2, oops, hit the microphone. Generator 2 is the marginal unit. So they end up setting the cost of energy at $60. So in this example, the cost of energy for this particular hour is $60. That is what the load serving entity pays. That is what generator 2 gets paid. Now we're introducing the concept of congestion here. So even though the market clearing price for energy is that $60, you can see how the congestion component affects generator 1 because they are on the other side of the congestion here. So they have that $60 energy price, but they also have a congestion component that means that their LMP is actually going to be $40. So what they receive at their price node was affected by congestion. Therefore, they get paid for their 150 megawatts, an LMP of $40, and this marginal unit generator 2 is paid for their megawatts at $60. Now, the point of this example is to kind of lead into how we manage congestion rents at the ISO. So we're going to keep walking down this path. I see some kind of furrowed brows, and some people might be thinking, okay, so what happened to that $20? Like, where does that go? And so we're going to take you down that path to explain that to you. So here's where we're seeing that discrepancy, right? Cost of energy is, or the price of energy is $60. My LMP, if I'm generator one, is $40. Congestion is affecting me. So let's talk about how that works. So we're going to recap this example. For this particular interval, load paid $18,000. Generator one gets paid $6,000. Generator two gets paid $9,000. If we put that all together, you know, side by side, you can see that load was charged $18,000 and the generators were paid $15,000. So there's this $3,000 of what we call congestion revenue or congestion rents that kind of has to be allocated out some way. In the ISO BA, we use what's called congestion revenue rights to allocate out that those congestion rents. So if that load serving entity happened to have congestion revenue rights, or we shorten that to CRRs, they could potentially offset those congestion costs, right? You see that they were essentially charged $3,000 more because of congestion. So that congestion revenue gets allocated out to CRR holders. And there's a whole process for determining who has those congestion revenue rights. We at the ISO allocate some congestion revenue rights to load serving entities as they're the ones that are paying those congestion costs. So if we kind of walk that path, which I'll do in a moment, you can see how that they're able to recoup some of those costs. I did put up a little bullet down here at the bottom because this is where I wanted to point out that when we're talking about congestion rents in this example, I'm sharing with you how we do this in the ISO BA in the day ahead market, but allocation of congestion rents, when you're thinking about this in future planning from the EDAM perspective, this is something that the stakeholders and the policy team right now are discussing the different options for managing these congestion rents or that revenue. This is how we handle it in the ISO BA. So entities get these congestion revenue rights to essentially offset these day ahead congestion costs. I was explaining that this calculation in day ahead is based on calculated congestion. So we are gathering congestion rents in day ahead, even though that electricity hasn't yet flowed. But it does affect pricing. So congestion revenue rights are used to manage that congestion cost variability based on that LMP pricing. We saw that difference, right? One resource was getting 40, another resource was getting 60. It can be complex in that there is a source location and a sink location and a direction of flow, and also how many megawatts that get allocated out. Congestion revenue rights are allocated to load serving entities. Allocated means given to. There is also an auction process where anybody who is a congestion revenue rights participant can bid to essentially purchase some of those congestion revenue rights through an auction process. That's also something that we have as well. So if we, again, go back to this example where we have load paying $18,000 and generator one getting $6,000, generator two getting $9,000, if that load serving entity, if we assume they had a CRR for 100 megawatts, I don't expect you to look at the calculation and have that mean anything to you, but essentially there's a certain amount of megawatts at the source and the sink, and they calculate that out to figure out how many dollars are collected in this congestion revenue bucket, if you will. In the earlier example, they paid $3,000 on account of that congestion. If they had a 100 megawatt CRR, you could see that they would have earned back or been able to collect back 2,000 of what they had paid. So congestion revenue rights is a way to help manage variability with congestion and to allow those load serving entities to, recoup some of that congestion rents that they're paying for in the day ahead timeframe. So I took you down a long kind of path of an example that gave you not only the three components of the LMP, but also then a side note kind of detour to explain to you how we manage congestion in our BA, to kind of help you tee up the congestion revenue conversation later during EDAM, and also the pricing to give you that foundation that we're going to plug in that greenhouse gas component into as well. So that's as like deep and technical as we're going to get in this session. But I'm happy to take any questions that you have based on what we've talked about. Yeah, so the question was, on what basis do we allocate CRRs? So we do that based on a load serving entity and their footprint, how much load that they serve. I would just say that at a high level, there's specific calculations that just aren't embedded in my brain, but essentially it's kind of like their share of load, that particular location, how many megawatts that they're serving. Yeah. Other questions about how this works? Didn't mean to blow your minds with all this, but this is, like I said, this is about how deep we're going to go, and then we're going to pull it up a little bit and fly away from the topic. Yes.
So in this case, we talked about 100 megawatts of the 150 megawatts. The remaining 50 megawatts go to some other CRR, right? Holder.
Could be, yes. In this example, if they had 100 megawatts, maybe somebody else has 50 megawatts on that line, could be another load serving entity, could be someone who obtained those CRRs through auction.
Is it the case that the capacity on these, the transfer limit is always allocated or auctioned off to 100%? Or I'm just curious, the relationship between.
That's a good question. I don't know exactly how exactly we get to the limits. I do know that from the CRR auction perspective, there are annual and there are monthly auctions and allocations. I also know that the amount of megawatts that are available gets impacted by planned outages on the transmission system as well. So we do our best to reflect the actual capability that's going to be in place during that time period. But how close we actually get, I don't have that information on the tip of my tongue.
Is it true that load pays the LMP at its location and generators receive the LMP at their locations?
Oh, good question. Generators have a price location where they're located, and generators receive the LMP at that one pricing node. From a load perspective, load actually pays for their consumption at what we call a DLAP, or a default load aggregation point, which is actually a collection of all of the load nodes in their territory. So let's say NV Energy, for example. I don't know if they have one or two load areas, but they would pay for their consumption the weighted average of all of the load nodes in that area. So load actually pays differently for their consumption, and it's spread across that entire footprint, the weighted average price of each of those individual load nodes.
And can you explain anything about any reasoning behind the way that load pays as compared to generators?
Sorry, could you repeat that one more time?
Just any of the reasoning behind why it's different for load.
Oh, why? Okay, yeah, absolutely. So I would say part of it is political, in that if I'm a load serving entity and I've got a large area that I'm serving, and some of it is more expensive to serve, and perhaps that area may be lower income, and then I've got other areas that might be cheaper to serve, and that is a higher income area. You don't want to kind of force the folks in the lower income areas to pay this higher price for their energy. compared to other folks. You kind of want to have a more uniform rate, if you will. So when we are forming these prices, it was the strong feelings of the load serving entities to say, we don't want to have individual pricing like that. We want to have a weighted average across our area so that when we are charging our customers for their consumption, we don't have to say like, oh, well, you live in such and such area. It's going to be way more expensive for you as compared to other areas. So it's more from a like a ratepayer fairness perspective that this was put in place so that they can have kind of their set of rates more, let's say hourly, if you will, that you're paying for your electricity and less based on geographic areas. I would say that's the best reason I can use to explain why load serving entities want it priced this way. Does that help answer your question?
And would it, I guess this is a fairly speculative question, so you don't have to answer, but would there be any argument for just having all of the different load nodes throughout the market pay the same price? Would that help with fairness at all, or would that be kind of, I don't know, different regions subsidizing others?
Yeah, I don't know if I know enough to be able to answer that question. Like you said, I'm not sure whether or not it would be something well received. I don't know if I have any insight into the front row as to you know, how we feel about that. But yeah, I think I don't know enough about all of the players and the moving parts to be able to answer that question. I think what you're alluding to is, you know, could it possibly be that there's like one Western rate for energy? And I'm not sure, if I'm being frank, that we would find a way to come to what that number should be in any kind of consensus with all of the players. It seems unrealistic to me. Yes.
You mentioned how the DLAP was a weighted average of all the nodal prices. So is it really just a zero-sum game where they're essentially paying for their load at each node, but they're calling it a DLAP price rather than individual prices for each?
I'm not sure that I would I'm not sure if I would characterize that as a zero-sum game necessarily. I think it's also, frankly, easier from a settlements perspective to have one price for your consumption as opposed to a bunch of different prices at a bunch of different nodes. So not only would it be a political reason, you know, as we discussed earlier, but also just from a, you know, we settle in 5-minute increments every single hour of the day. And if you had to do that at more than just one price, but a price for every individual load node, I think it would be prohibitive just from a processing perspective, if you will. So,
but somewhere in the background at Kaizo, it's being calculated. It's sort of been taking all those nodal prices and that entity's loaded each one to get
right. So
that's
somewhere
happening in there.
Somewhere in the background, yes, there is a price for each individual load node. And yes, then that gets aggregated together and charged to demand at that DLAP price. But it could be, I'm sure, disaggregated and they could figure out what the price was at each individual node as well.
And is there a DLAP for the 5-minute and the 15-minute?
The way that we settle pricing for demand is a little bit different. So it ends up being, and I don't have a slide in this deck for that, it ends up being more like an hourly price, but it ends up being the weighted, there's an average of the 4 15-minute prices and the 12 5-minute. So it's
Okay.
more complex. So we take all of the 15-minute prices and the 5-minute prices to come up with the price we're going to charge for the hour for this particular load location. So it's kind of a deconstruction and then a putting back together, if you will.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure thing. Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering, is there a point where congestion in one certain location gets so great where any sort of incentive might kick in, or a possible generator supplier, QF, you know, is encouraged by either CAISO or the state or some entity to build additional generation in that region when congestion is just proven to be so great?
So I would say that factors into the transmission planning process and could be an element as to why a specific transmission project gets approved in a particular area if there is kind of this proven need. So it's definitely, I would say, something that factors more into the longer term transmission planning process. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is Phil. I'll just give you an example. Early on in California, in the California ISO operations, we had a pretty significant constraint from northern to southern California on the 500 kV intertie. And ultimately, that transmission path was upgraded principally because of the congestion costs. Now, one of the interesting things you have when you look at this, right, is it's really what's the total volume of congestion rents that you're paying, over what period of time? Because of course it could be really severe for a few hours or a few days out of the year, but does that necessarily become a good investment to spend what might be hundreds of millions of dollars on new transmission? And so in this case, even though that transmission project was upgraded, and what we see is in most cases, it's enough of a marginal cost to get all the way to 100% reduction of congestion. The most transmission upgrades do not do that. They end up something short of that.
Thanks for that context. I appreciate it. Yeah.
And Rada, this is Milos. While we were just on congestion rents, just wanted to note that what Rada was describing, the congestion revenue rights process and the allocation and the auction, that's something that's unique to the ISO today. There is congestion rent allocation in the EIM today, and I'll mention it briefly when we get to EDAM, where we're kind of extending the same framework, but there is congestion rent allocation in the EIM that's present today, and that's allocated to the balancing authority area, the EIM entity, and the EIM entity then allocates that to its transmission customers under its own tariff. Each EIM entity may have different provisions on how ultimately they allocate these congestion rents to their customers, either load or other sets of customers. But there is that process in the EIM today. They also receive congestion rents and allocate it under the terms of their own open access transmission tariff.
Great. Thanks for that, Milos. All right. So wrapping up this topic section. So LMPs are used to settle the day ahead market energy, real-time market as well. They're made up of energy, congestion, and losses. That'll be the foundation for you, where we're going to plug in that greenhouse gas component in later discussions. Congestion costs are charged to the scheduling coordinators for load, and congestion revenue rights are then allocated to load to offset those congestion costs. And then we also offer opportunities to purchase CRRs, so the ability to earn some of that congestion revenue through an auction process. And again, that auction process takes place on both an annual and a monthly basis. So that kind of wraps up that discussion. Now, the last little piece that we have, we're going to talk about convergence bidding, and then we're going to wrap up settlements, and then we'll lead into this afternoon's discussion. You had a question, yes?
Yeah, so the CRRs, it sounds like they're allocated at no cost. Is that right?
Correct.
But they're auctioned at a cost.
Yes.
And where does the money go from the auction?
Back to the CRR process.
Into that sort of fund of
Into like the
3,000.
CRR bucket. So and I think when we get to a little bit of talking about settlements, but essentially from a market clearing perspective, the ISO is a nonprofit organization. So each of these things that we're doing kind of funds itself, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So when we do market clearing, all of the money that is owed to the market gets paid in, and then we pay it out in the afternoon. If there's something left over, it still doesn't go to us. It has to fall into some other bucket or get reallocated back out to load or in some other way. So the congestion revenue rights auctions fund some of that process and go into the CRR management and kind of that bucket, if you will. And then there's the allocation out of those dollars based on the rents that were accrued. So it kind of is kept in the CRR bubble, if you will. And of course, there's calculations that are involved in that, but that's kind of the world that we'll touch today is that, yeah, it's kind of maintained in that CRR bucket. So convergence bidding, we'll talk about it briefly. I did want to point out that when we're talking about the concept of implementing convergence bidding, in an EDAM perspective, this is one of those elements that were discussed and identified as not necessarily something that's going to be turned on day one, year one, but more of a implementation plan to kind of roll this out, perhaps have a year or so period where you become comfortable with the market before introducing something like this. So I don't intend to spend terribly too much time on this topic. I'll talk about it a little bit. Milos is going to talk about it a little bit this afternoon, but we're going to just kind of bring it up just for discussion purposes. Convergence bidding is a concept that exists in any ISO that has both a day ahead and a real-time market. So this is not unique to the California ISO in concept, but any ISO that has both a day ahead and a real-time market has this concept of convergence bidding. It's something, it's an element of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's standard market design, something we implemented, I think it was in 2009, if my memory serves me correctly. The goal of convergence bidding, or we also refer to this as virtual bidding, is to provide for the ability for financial participation in the market without any physical resources supporting those financial transactions. So virtual bidding is purely a financial way for participants to bid into the day ahead market and then have those bids liquidate in real time. Prior to the implementation of convergence bidding, there was activity that was occurring like this because there wasn't some sort of product where they could do it in. So folks would perhaps bid in day ahead, and then in real time they would buy it back. So this gives them very specific capability to do just that through this financial product. The goal of virtual bidding, and I'll walk through an example of kind of how it works on both sides. The goal of it is to kind of go along with the terminology. We call it convergence bidding because the goal is to bring the prices in day ahead and real time closer together, and that action is called convergence. So converging or bringing together the prices between day ahead and real time so that there is less volatility between those two, both from day ahead to real time and also kind of intra-hour, if you will. It leads to more efficient market outcomes when we have a more liquid market. So when there is more liquidity in the market can solve and optimize in the best way. And the final kind of bullet on this slide says it eliminates the need for scheduling penalties. So if you think back to when we were talking about demand bids in the day ahead time frame, and I had said there is no requirement that you have to bid into the day ahead all of your load forecast. You can choose to bid in a portion of that, if you will. So we don't have any type of rules or requirements that you have to bid everything in, and therefore we also don't have any penalties if you do not. But this introduction of virtual bidding allows this kind of financial participation to essentially replace some of maybe that load or supply that's being held back through those bids. And if we kind of augment the market with these financial transactions, both on the virtual supply and virtual demand side, it kind of allows us to clear more megawatts for each hour so that we're more prepared to go into day ahead, clearing more megawatts for that hour. And this financial participation kind of allows that to occur. So I've got an example or bullet points that kind of explain virtual demand and virtual supply. And so we'll walk through both of those. First of all, this is a day ahead only. So in day ahead, if I am a virtual demand, I'm essentially saying I'm demand. I would like to buy from the market a certain amount of megawatts. And then in real time, my bids are going to liquidate in this same hour against whatever those real time prices are. So in day ahead, I'm submitting a bid to buy megawatts. Assuming that my bid clears, I pay whatever that day ahead price is, because from the market perspective, demand is the consumer. So I'm paying the day ahead price, and then in real time, the market automatically sells those megawatts back, and the bidder gets paid whatever the real time price is. So my goal then is to pay a lower price in day ahead and get paid back a higher price in real time, if that makes sense. So if I'm a virtual demand bidder, that's what I'm hoping will occur. This clears based on whatever the day ahead price for energy is and the average of the 4 15-minute prices in real time for that same hour. So I pick a load, I pick a node, a location, an hour, and I submit my bids and then see when that hour actually takes place. Whoops, whether I speak with my hands too much to keep hitting this mic. Whether that bid, whether I actually make money or not, depend on that transaction. Virtual supply is exactly the other side of the coin, right? I'm a supplier, so I'm saying in day ahead, I'm selling megawatts. So I get paid whatever that day ahead price is. And then in real time, that bid liquidates the same hour against the 4 15-minute prices for that particular hour. And then I pay back whatever the real time price is. So here I'm hoping that the real time price that I have to pay back at is lower than what I received in day ahead, if that makes sense. Questions?
It's like short selling securities.
You could liken it to that. It is, other folks have likened it to maybe options, but there's not really any optionality. It's more like financial swaps, if you will, concept. Yeah. So that's what it is. It occurs in internal nodes at the ISOBA. I know there's a lot of discussion about whether or not folks who would be joining EDAM are comfortable with this type of a concept, maybe not something that they want to immediately embrace right away. So like I said, we're telling you about how it works. Milos is going to touch on it a little bit later as well, but this is kind of to get your thought processes flowing. And then again, this is not something that was intended to go in day one, year one, but kind of perhaps a transition period to make sure that we're comfortable with how everything works before kind of diving in all the way. A couple more points about convergence bidding. There is no physical schedule ever associated with any of those virtual transactions. So no physical energy is exchanged based on any of these financial transactions. They're also not backed by any physical assets. So I could be a convergence bidding participant only and have no physical resources, or I could have a bunch of physical resources in my fleet, and I could also be a convergence bidder. And none of my convergence bidding awards would ever have a connection, and I would never have to dispatch any of my physical resources in relation to a convergence bid award that I received. So it's financial products and they're completely separate. That was what this bullet point said. There's no link between the two if I bid for both physical and virtual. Now, how does convergence bidding impact the market? It could possibly impact pricing. So we've got the supply curves and the demand curves in day ahead. And we have virtual supply bids along the same curve as physical supply, and virtual demand bids along the same curve as all of the physical demand. So it's possible in a particular hour that we could be clearing more supply or demand based on some of this virtual activity. And if you remember, we talk about marginal clearing price. It's possible that one of these virtual bids could set the price. Now, if you think about it from a physical incentive perspective, if I've got physical resources, generators and load, who we want to bid into the market in day ahead and bring everything there so we can have a robust clearing, if they're not doing that and these financial participants are kind of coming in to try to set the price, the virtual bidding also acts as an incentive for our physical resources to get them to come into day ahead and to bid in as much of their demand as they have, and their suppliers to come into day ahead and to bid in as much of their supply as possible. So from a market robustness perspective, we want everybody to be bringing all of their bids into day ahead, and having these financial participants in there is an incentive for those physical players to actually bid into the day ahead, as opposed to perhaps holding back a little bit and trying to wait to see if they could find better prices in real time. There was a question, yes.
Thanks. With respect to this idea, Is no physical energy, not a player, just a financer. Is that a normal hedging activity for somebody in the finance business? Or is this actually a product that's promoting speculation?
I would say that we do have financial players, but I'm not sure if I perhaps even know enough to discuss whether or not it falls into the category of like purely speculation. I haven't done a big deep dive into, I guess, what they're doing on their side. I don't know if any of the ISO folks in the room have anything else they might want to add
I'm
to that
just thinking
discussion.
of the way commodities trade on the Chicago Futures Exchange. And that, if you're a wheat farmer or you grow corn, you can play in that market because you're hedging your crop. You're building in your profit margin before the corn is harvested and sold, right? So that's a hedging function. That's normally very healthy. But you also have speculators that come into that market that are just financial people. An expression used years ago, got a hunch, bet a bunch.
Okay. Yeah, I know that virtual bidding is part of and can be used as a hedging mechanism as well. I think Milos had a comment he wanted to add as well.
Yeah, I was just going to note, and I think you had it in a couple of slides before, but FERC found, significant benefits, and it's a feature of every market, this concept of convergence and virtual bidding as a hedging mechanism, but also it provides certain benefits to the market and convergence between prices. There is that risk of manipulation as with other elements of the market, but that's where we have there's a Department of Market Monitoring that's constantly monitoring some of these activities and participation in the market to ensure that there's not this speculation, or to the extent that it's found that there are certain actions that can be taken. But maybe Amelia can speak to that if she wants to a little bit more what DMM's role is in looking at these types of activities. But FERC has found it a fairly healthy aspect and benefit to the market in various areas, and it's a design feature every market in the United States, including the ISO. But there are those risks, and that's why we have the Department of Market Monitoring too.
Expand to say, you mentioned earlier in the markets that I misused the word casino earlier there, Phil. Sorry about that, but you really screen people coming in to participate in the energy imbalance market, in the day-ahead market. They've got to be big boys to withstand the financial wherewithal to deliver, or if they don't deliver, pay the fine, pay the fee. How about these financial speculators? Is there a gatekeeper watching, making sure they're...
That's right. That's right. There are certain requirements, financial and otherwise, for them to be able to participate in the market that are fairly hefty. And then, like I said, there's on the back end, there's the role of the Department of Market Monitoring that's constantly monitoring their activities and participation in different elements of the market. Yeah.
Sure thing. Okay.
Just to add one thing quickly to what Rada and Milos were saying. I mean, the idea in theory about the benefits of financial participation is if there are these arbitrage opportunities, right, that as they're saying, that financial players, in the best case, this wisdom of the market, because they're strongly incentivized, if there's some systematic difference that they anticipate between day ahead and real time, they're incentivized to arbitrage that away. And that's what provides some of the benefits that Rada was talking about, that there are advantages of having those day ahead and real time prices be closer, because it means you're scheduling things more accurately. You're reducing the generation costs overall. Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Can I add one more thing real quick? One thing that wasn't really mentioned was collateral as well. So that's part of that financial backing. They've got to have their collateral that's put in there, and when the market clears, until there's like a bucket process. So their collateral could be locked up for a couple of days until it goes back to the value they want. So they also have limitations. They can't just go crazy. So
Well, hopefully,
That's the fail-safe answer to the question, by the way. Thank you very much.
Well, hopefully in the games tomorrow at the very end, we'll be able to demonstrate really quickly just how virtual bidding could have a salutary effect.
All right. And eating into now, Phil and Heidi gave me about 30 extra minutes and I took all of them plus some. So I've got a couple slides that I'll try to wrap up real fast so that I make sure that I get Phil and Milos their time. But I think this has been a lot of good discussion. Last point on this slide, last 2 points on this slide is that convergence bidding could affect the amount of congestion because in day ahead we have calculated congestion. So it could impact congestion as well. There's also some analysis that's done to make sure that if you're a convergence bidder, you're not also artificially inflating your congestion revenue rights. So there's a bunch of checks and balances in place to make sure things are running appropriately. And then finally, when we are procuring for RUC, that residual unit commitment, when we take a look at what cleared today, in each one of those hours in the day ahead market for tomorrow's load forecast, we actually remove all of the virtual transactions from that equation so that we have a clear picture of what physically cleared the market for each hour. We compare that to the forecast to make sure that we procure enough to meet what's necessary. So convergence bidding may have an effect on that RUC procurement target. And then finally, and this will be fast, so I can give Phil his time, and Milos as well. A little bit about the outputs of the day ahead market. So we're going to talk a little bit about the settlements. We kind of spoke to this earlier. The results of the day ahead market kind of are a starting point for that real-time market. So I have day ahead energy schedules. I have RUC awards and awards for ancillary services that turn into bids for energy in real time. I also have new real-time bids for capacity as well. So the day ahead market activity feeds the real-time market and serves as a kind of a base or a schedule for that activity. There are financial transactions that occur for the day ahead market in addition to all of the financial settlements that occur in real time. So in day ahead, we're settling physical energy and virtual energy. We're settling awards for ancillary services, for residual unit commitment. We have a process called bid cost recovery that takes a look to see if you are able to recoup enough costs and earn enough revenue across the entire day to cover your operating costs. And if not, you receive a bid cost recovery uplift payment so that those resources are made whole. And then, as I mentioned, the ISO is a nonprofit organization, so it's not like we get a percentage of all of those transactions that are occurring in the market. There is separately to the folks that are participating in the ISO market, all of those scheduling coordinators, what we call a GMC or grid management cost and fees associated with that. So that is how the ISO is funded. So that's part of the day ahead market settlements. There's also GMC with regard to real time as well. And from a supply perspective, we'll take this same example kind of and walk it through. I had an example of a supplier bidding in day ahead. So in real time, let's say I was awarded 120 megawatts. I'm going to be paid for that 120 megawatts at the day ahead price, which is an hourly price. In real time, if I receive a real time award for additional megawatts in the 15-minute market, I get paid for that at the 15-minute market price. And then if I'm dispatched any additional megawatts in the 5-minute market, there will be 5-minute pricing. So for my output of this resource, I could be getting varying prices depending on which market awarded which megawatts. So kind of to recap our little section here, we have the day ahead market process where folks are submitting their bids for energy and for ancillary services. We've got the market products that or the market processes that include market power mitigation, some of the financial products like congestion revenue rights. We talked about the inputs and outputs of the market and how we clear for residual unit commitment to make sure that we're meeting the forecast for the coming day. And that's it. So in the interest of time, I think we'll take a quick break here, 5 minutes to get Phil and Milos an opportunity to set up. And then if you have any lingering questions for me, I'd be happy to take those kind of at the conclusion of the session. We just don't want to keep you here all night. So thank you very much.